Hey, welcome to Dart Throwing Spider Monkey. Metaculus has launched a new competition recently, which involves forecasting mobility trends in the US. What I thought I'd do is talk through my approach to this tournament, and hopefully some of you might find it useful. The question is essentially just about predicting the next terms in data series. There's a GitHub link in the question which takes you to all of the data, but I've actually cleaned it up and put it into a graphing calculator called Desmos, which is here. Let's move to the New York dataset. The purple crosses are the raw data, and the black dots are the 7-day moving average, which I calculated in Excel before I plugged in. These vertical lines are the dates we're predicting for. There's 2 questions on New York. If we look at the series of questions, one is what's the mean level of transport in the last week of October, and the other is what's the mean level of transport in the last week of November. So these, the blue and green vertical line respectively, correspond to those dates. And essentially what I did was I looked at the data and drew lines, and this is what Desmos is really, really good for. I just drew lines by eye that represented my intuition for different things. So something like this is sort of, if stuff carries on broadly as it has done before, like we've got this fairly linear region here, we're saying, okay, if stuff carries on like that, we're expecting, you know, about 56. But I can do other things. I can say, so we had like this fairly steep recovery rate a while ago, something that looks more like that. And so I might say that's about as fast as travel's recovered. So let's say it's probably not going to recover any faster than that. And so if I can now then find an intercept, let's just drop B to here. Okay. So now I can say, well, if like whatever was causing the suppression and recovery suddenly disappears, I can be like really confident that mobility in New York won't recover to more than like 66-ish, because like that's the fastest it's ever really recovered, and I don't have any reason to think that it's suddenly going to recover. So those are the sort of thought process I can do. Similarly, sort of the steepest drop it's ever had is kind of roughly that steep. We can see just by moving to this the graph, and I might again want to say I'm like fairly confident, I might be like 95% confident that it won't drop any more quickly than that. And then again I can sort of say, okay, well, if it drops at that rate it'll get to 41. Similarly, I can just look here and go, well, there's literally no way it's going to drop below 13. Like it never has. It didn't right after the start of the coronavirus pandemic. This is sort of pre-pandemic, then lockdown. If it drops to 13, then it's not going to drop below 13 in the next 2 weeks, kind of regardless of what happens. So that's like my main source of generating kind of different intuitions. One thing it's worth looking at is, at least currently, sort of coronavirus data, and we can see that there's a big spike in cases in New York, and you can see that part of that's accounted for by new testing, but far from all of it. Similarly, though, these are lagging indicators, i.e. they sort of tell you the state a few weeks ago. The fact that both hospitalizations and deaths have been increasing in New York is not a good sign in terms of New York's recovery, and therefore is also not a good sign in terms of New York's sort of mobility recovery. So once I've got all those intuitions, I put them together, and what I use to sort of do that, at least to start with, is Elicit. Elicit lets you just say, okay, I think that from my sort of normal line of best fit, my median outcome is 59. So this is just saying 50% of the probability is below 59. Then I said my sort of steepest recovery possible was 85, so I said it's impossible for it to be above 85. Similarly, I sort of think it's no way going to go below 15. And then my sort of 5% and my 95% here, this is what I was talking about before, where I essentially kind of said, what's the steepest that it's ever recovered before, what's the steepest it's ever dropped before, and how do those correspond to current data. Then this last sort of 50 to 63 region is essentially me saying, like, my best guess is between these range, and depending on how confident I am, I could either sort of narrow these numbers and keep 60% here, or I could increase this to, let's say, 80%, with these numbers staying the same. What Elicit then does is it outputs that graph into the question. And I've actually, my first Elicit output doesn't look exactly like this, because I've since got some new data. I can actually show you the data that I generated the Elicit plot with looks like this, and I added the last few days and made some updates. And I just made those updates by playing with the sliders. essentially, this is pretty much exactly the line I expected, but we're now closer to the deadline and we're not seeing a sharp recovery yet. So I get slightly more confident about the situation essentially continuing as normal, and I get slightly more confident that both the highest interval and the lowest interval are not quite as bad as one might expect. So my curve ends up looking something like this. Just for comparison, if we go to New York in November, you'll see kind of a very similar shape, but like much, much wider. This is a good example where Elicit does like generating these really, really, really narrow distributions that just don't really do very much. It's kind of annoying, actually. I've asked for the distributions to be generated such that these things with really low weight actually end up at the bottom, so we can remove components more easily. But it's not a huge deal, and you can do it by hand if you really care. So that's how I forecast sort of data series questions. I come up with some intuitions. I model those intuitions using Desmos, just by being able to draw lines. You don't have to draw straight lines, by the way, but you can put any function you like in here. Just as a quick example, if I wanted to make this quadratic, which is like a terrible model, there we go. Now it's a terrible model, but something else for, we can say, oh look, maybe it's going to kind of die off like that. Now, the nice thing about this and the difficult thing about this is, because Desmos is sort of representing your intuitions here, if your intuitions suck, like, so will your predictions. The good news for sort of skilled predictors is this is a really good way of representing your intuitions like quickly. Like, I find this really intuitive to use, and you can get nice results from it. So that's how to forecast and how to win the new series. Just don't beat me, please.